The Fifth Party System, 1932-1968, was born in the shadow of the Great Depression and cemented by Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It created a democratic coalition unlike any before. Southern segregationists, Northern immigrants, labor unions, intellectual elites, and, increasingly, black voters in the urban North. This coalition delivered massive federal expansion, Social Security, labor protections, housing programs, that reshaped the relationship between government and the people. But was this expansion true progress? Or did it quietly erode the independence that had once been the backbone of American life? Did the New Deal bind citizens together, or bind them more tightly to Washington? By the 1940s and 1950s, the cracks began to show. Truman desegregated the military. Eisenhower enforced Brown v. Board. Kennedy hesitated, and Johnson drove through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Each step was a triumph for equality, but also a blow to the old coalition. The South peeled away, riots tore through cities, and by 1968, Nixon's silent majority signaled the end of Democratic dominance. The question remains, was the Fifth Party System the high watermark of American democracy or the beginning of its unraveling? Did its victories secure liberty or plant the seeds of division that would fracture the nation for generations to come? In April 1945, Harry Truman assumed the presidency with little preparation and enormous responsibility. He later admitted he felt as if the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on him when told of Roosevelt's death. On his first day, he asked Roosevelt's cabinet to remain, though most would soon be replaced with allies from his Senate years. Within weeks, Truman found himself leading a nation celebrating victory in Europe while preparing for a final, brutal showdown in the Pacific. In July, at the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Churchill, he received word that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested. He authorized its use against Japan, believing it would prevent an invasion projected to cost up to 1 million American casualties and millions more Japanese lives. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed in August, killing more than 100,000. Japan surrendered days later, ending World War II but beginning the nuclear age. The end of the war brought new turmoil at home. Americans feared a slide back into depression, while unions, strengthened by the war, demanded higher wages and tried to secure permanent gains through massive strikes. Truman faced runaway inflation as price controls were lifted, along with unrest in industries from steel to railroads. His approval rating plummeted from over 80% to the low 30s by 1946, and Republicans won control of Congress for the first time since 1930. Truman fought back. He vetoed tax cuts and denounced the Taft-Hartley Act, which weakened organized labor, though Congress passed it over his veto. He threatened to draft striking railroad workers into the Army, a plan that collapsed only when the strike ended suddenly. These crises tested his leadership and earned him a reputation for blunt, decisive action, even when unpopular. Preparing for re-election in 1948, Truman advanced what he called the Fair Deal, a continuation of Roosevelt's New Deal, but with bold new aims. National health insurance, expanded Social Security, repeal of Taft-Hartley, and most controversially, an aggressive push for civil rights. Truman declared civil rights a moral priority, a stance that split the Democratic Party and led to the Dixiecrat Revolt. Still, he managed to win re-election in one of the greatest upsets in U.S. history, defeating Thomas Dewey. Most of his Fair Deal agenda stalled in Congress, with only the Housing Act of 1949 enacted, but Truman had redefined the presidency. In his first term, he carried the nation from World War to uneasy peace, defended the New Deal legacy, and planted the seeds of the Civil Rights Revolution, all while learning, often painfully, what it meant to lead in an era of nuclear power and partisan division. The Cold War became Truman's defining challenge. With the Soviet Union tightening its grip on Eastern Europe, Truman declared before Congress in 1947 that America must support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. This Truman doctrine formalized a new policy of containment, pledging U.S. resources to stop communism wherever it spread. The boldest move came with the Marshall Plan, a $13 billion program to rebuild Western Europe. Truman argued that communism thrives in desperation. Rebuild economies, and you weaken Moscow's reach. To manage this new global conflict of communism, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, revolutionizing government. The Department of War and Department of the Navy merged into a unified Department of Defense, The Air Force became its own branch. The National Security Council was created to advise the president, and the CIA was born, giving the U.S. a permanent peacetime intelligence agency. Later, Truman secretly authorized the NSA, embedding surveillance into the DNA of government. In the name of containment, America remade its own state. Yet while Truman rallied the world against tyranny abroad, Jim Crow laws at home were already setting a pathway towards communism by offering poor, disillusioned Black Americans and sympathetic intellectuals an alternative ideology that promised equality where American democracy seemed to be falling short. In 1948, Henry Wallace's Progressive Party campaign, backed by communist organizers, drew early support from African Americans frustrated by segregation, only to splinter Black churches as pastors warned against infiltration of the pulpit. In 1951, Paul Robeson carried that fight to the world stage, presenting the petition "We Charge Genocide" to the United Nations, accusing the United States of systematic oppression. And as the Civil Rights Congress rallied to defend victims of Jim Crow injustices, it often partnered with local Black congregations, creating both opportunity and unease. Communism thrived by promising equality where democracy faltered, yet the Black church remained the great mediator, resisting takeover while carrying the moral authority that would soon fuel a new civil rights generation. Truman's successor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would inherit not only a global Cold War, but also the delicate task of confronting these contradictions at home. When Dwight D. Eisenhower returned from Europe as the hero of World War II, the public saw not a politician but a commander who embodied order and victory. By 1952, amid Korean stalemate and Cold War tension, America longed for a steady hand. Though Harry Truman urged him to run as a Democrat, Eisenhower declared himself a Republican, breaking with New Deal liberalism, but not with its legacy. His "I Like Ike" campaign cut through partisan noise with simplicity, and his selection of Richard Nixon balanced the ticket with youthful anti-communist zeal. Once in office, Eisenhower made clear his goals: balance the budget, end the Korean War, and use nuclear deterrence to defend U.S. interests at lower cost. For the first time in history, he convened a pre-inaugural cabinet meeting, underscoring his belief in preparation and clarity. His inaugural address pledged loyalty to trade, alliances, and the United Nations, setting a tone of restrained but firm leadership. In governance, Eisenhower crafted what he called dynamic conservatism. He held firm against both extremes, rejecting the old guard's push to dismantle Social Security and labor protections while refusing liberal demands for sweeping new welfare programs. Instead, he expanded Social Security, created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and extended benefits to millions of new workers. He also moved to complete the racial integration of the armed services, a task Truman had started but left unfinished. Eisenhower saw himself as a moderate and warned that any party trying to abolish core protections like Social Security would be politically doomed. By midterm elections in 1954, he positioned himself not as a partisan warrior, but as a builder of a progressive Republican Party, one that valued stability and pragmatism over ideology. The truth was both parties were paralyzed. Democrats feared alienating Southern whites. Republicans feared losing Northern moderates. The paralysis deepened after the Supreme Court's landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. Eisenhower personally harbored doubts about whether social change should be driven from the bench. But as president, he respected the court's authority and the constitutional order. His leadership style valued stability over ideology, and he was reluctant to inflame either side in the bitter divide over race. Yet when open defiance erupted in Arkansas 3 years later, Eisenhower proved willing to act decisively. By sending federal troops to enforce integration in Little Rock, he made clear that the Constitution was not optional. His decision was not born of radicalism, but of duty. The rule of law had to stand above politics, even in the face of Southern resistance. It was the first time since Reconstruction that federal troops had been sent to the South to enforce civil rights. The sight of soldiers safeguarding children on their way to class sent shockwaves through the nation and the world, signaling that the federal government would no longer tolerate open defiance of the Supreme Court. In a letter of gratitude, Martin Luther King Jr. praised Eisenhower's resolve, writing, "The overwhelming majority of Southerners, Negro and white, stand firmly behind your resolute action to restore law and order in Little Rock. Eisenhower's second term was marked by both health scares and enduring achievements, none more significant than the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Drawing on his experience as a young officer traveling cross-country with the Army and his observations of Germany's Autobahn system during World War II, Eisenhower envisioned a national network of highways that would unite commerce, strengthen national defense, and transform everyday American life. The act authorized the construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways, the largest public works project in U.S. history. More than an infrastructure plan, it reshaped the geography of America. Suburbs flourished, industries grew, and military mobility was secured. As his presidency closed, Eisenhower left behind not only the memory of a steady hand during the Cold War, but also the physical blueprint of modern America, etched in concrete and asphalt. The 1950s civil rights movement cannot be told without the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which led the charge in the courts. Under the leadership of attorneys like Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund waged a decade-long battle against Jim Crow segregation. Its crowning achievement came in 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, when the Supreme Court unanimously declared separate but equal unconstitutional in public education. This decision shook the South and inspired a generation of activists. President Eisenhower, though personally cautious and skeptical about judicially forced social change, upheld the court's authority, even as Southern leaders promised massive resistance. The NAACP's legal victories proved that the Constitution could be a weapon for freedom, though it also revealed the deep chasm between law on paper and life on the ground. In the years after Brown, the NAACP became a target of white Southern lawmakers who saw it as a threat to their way of life. States like Alabama and Louisiana tried to shut down local chapters, harass members, and force the organization to disclose its membership lists, exposing people to violence. Despite this pressure, the NAACP pressed forward with lawsuits, boycotts, and local organizing. Their persistence kept the issue alive in federal courts and the national press, making it harder for politicians in Washington, including Eisenhower, to ignore the mounting tension. The organization's legal strategy provided the framework, but it also created space for a younger generation of activists to test bolder, more public tactics of resistance. By the mid-1950s, the NAACP had more than 450,000 members nationwide. The direct action phase of the movement was beginning. In Montgomery, Alabama, the 1955-56 bus boycott sparked by Rosa Parks' arrest electrified the country. Though initially coordinated by the local NAACP chapter led by E.D. Nixon, it catapulted a young Baptist minister, Martin Luther King Jr., into national prominence. Supported by the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, King and other ministers built a network that combined spiritual conviction with Gandhian, non-violent resistance. However, not all black churches rallied behind the new tactics of marches, boycotts, and sit-ins. Ministers like Reverend Joseph H. Jackson, president of the National Baptist Convention, preferred a cautious, non-political approach. Jackson feared that blending the pulpit with political agitation would endanger the church's spiritual mission and provoke violent backlash that could set the cause back. His resistance reflected a broader divide within the church. Younger ministers embraced a social gospel that supported civil rights and nonviolent protest as a prophetic calling, while older ministers like Jackson embraced biblical salvation, law and order, and quiet persistence as the safer and more faithful path. Nevertheless, across the South, black communities began experimenting with boycotts, sit-ins, and grassroots organizing. These tactics created a layered campaign. The NAACP pressed its case in the courts, while local leaders, often rooted in the church, mobilized congregations to take to the streets. Nonviolent protest carried moral weight, but it was not without controversy. The tactics drew national headlines, yet also sparked fierce backlash, branded by critics as unlawful or provocative. Still, the strategy worked. It helped shape the narrative of black nonviolent protesters versus violent white segregationists to television cameras, forcing both Washington and the wider public to reckon with the moral contradiction between American ideals and Southern realities. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s rise during the Montgomery bus boycott reflected this new moment. Through moral conviction, grassroots organizing, and nonviolent protest, ordinary citizens forced change in one of segregation's strongholds. King's leadership made him a symbol of hope in the Black church and a respected voice in national media. Yet beneath the surface, communism was shaping the leadership and strategy of the movement. Communists had long championed racial equality, and while most church leaders resisted their ideology, they did adopt the tactics of mass mobilization and direct action, class confliction and agitation, propaganda and narrative control, and international appeals for justice. By the late 1950s, Gallup polls showed most Americans agreed segregation was wrong, but many still thought civil rights leaders were pushing too fast. It would take generations later for the public to know just how much communism and Karl Marx influenced the civil rights movement of the 1950 to 1960s. John F. Kennedy's election in 1960 was more than a political victory. It symbolized a generational shift. Young, charismatic, and Catholic, Kennedy entered the White House with promises of a new frontier in American life. Yet behind the glamour of Camelot was a world on edge. The Cold War defined foreign policy from the Bay of Pigs fiasco to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was the battle for democracy at home that tested Kennedy's moral resolve. As he called America to lead the free world, millions of black citizens lived under Jim Crow, their voices rising with urgency for the same freedom America claimed to champion abroad. At the heart of this struggle stood Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose soaring rhetoric and disciplined nonviolence inspired both admiration and fear. The Montgomery bus boycott had proven the power of organized, peaceful protest, and by the early 1960s, King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference was coordinating mass demonstrations across the South. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches exposed the brutality of segregation to television cameras, forcing the federal government to confront the gap between its democratic ideals and its domestic realities. Kennedy admired King's moral clarity, but he also worried about political backlash in a nation still deeply divided. Meanwhile, Malcolm X offered a very different vision. Preaching black self-determination and criticizing integration as a false promise, Malcolm drew growing crowds with his sharp critiques of white America and his insistence that freedom must be taken, not begged for. The NAACP, working steadily in the courts, provided yet another layer of pressure through landmark legal challenges. Together, these voices created a chorus of demands, often divergent in tone but united in urgency. Communist movements abroad and at home looked for openings in this struggle, pointing to America's racial hypocrisy as evidence that its democracy was hollow. This made Kennedy's balancing act even more delicate, to answer the call of justice without giving ammunition to America's enemies. In foreign affairs, Kennedy inherited a Cold War world on the brink of disaster. His presidency was marked by both bold ambition and perilous crises. He approved the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a covert attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro that ended in humiliation and strengthened Cuba's ties to Moscow. Yet Kennedy quickly adapted, facing down Nikita Khrushchev in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war, until Kennedy's careful mix of firmness and back-channel diplomacy secured the removal of Soviet missiles. Abroad, he launched the Peace Corps and championed development programs to win hearts and minds in the Third World, recognizing that poverty and unrest often opened doors for communism. Kennedy's foreign policy was never just about military might. It was about shaping the image of America as both strong and just, a vision he struggled to reconcile with the realities of segregation at home. Watching all of this with suspicion was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Convinced that communist influence lurked behind civil rights activism, Hoover ordered constant surveillance of King, Malcolm X, and other black leaders. The Bureau sought to undermine their credibility even as these figures were reshaping America's moral landscape. Kennedy, for his part, began cautiously but grew bolder. In June 1963, after the violence in Birmingham shocked the nation, he declared civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Though his life was cut short that November, Kennedy's presidency marked a turning point. The convergence of Cold War leadership abroad and the civil rights revolution at home, setting the stage for Lyndon Johnson to push the movement's demands into law. In less than 3 years, John F. Kennedy reshaped America's image at home and abroad. He steered the nation through the gravest nuclear crisis in history, launched a vision of service and exploration that inspired the Peace Corps and the race to the moon, and, with words as much as policy, gave moral weight to the rising demand for civil rights. Though often cautious, he gave the presidency a sense of youthful energy and moral purpose that galvanized a generation. Kennedy did not live to see his promises fulfilled, but his brief time in office left behind an enduring call for courage in leadership, for justice at home, and for America to live up to its highest ideals. The official story of his assassination, pinned on Lee Harvey Oswald, remains contested with lingering doubts about CIA surveillance, Cold War enemies, and the role of organized crime. Kennedy's death did more than end a presidency. It opened an era of distrust, where Americans began to suspect that the government's story was not always the whole truth. Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency on November 22, 1963, just hours after Kennedy's assassination. A seasoned Senate dealmaker, Johnson used his political mastery to push through landmark civil rights legislation. In 1964, he signed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing segregation in public facilities and employment discrimination. A year later, he signed the Voting Rights Act, dismantling literacy tests and other barriers that had disenfranchised black voters for generations. Johnson framed these laws as a moral mission, declaring, "We shall overcome." Yet privately, his words told a different story. According to multiple accounts, Johnson crudely boasted that his policies would ensure, "I'll have those niggas voting Democratic for the next 200 years." For him, civil rights were not only about justice, they were about cementing a new democratic coalition. Beyond civil rights, Johnson launched his ambitious Great Society program, a sweeping expansion of the welfare state. Medicare and Medicaid were created, federal funds flowed into education and housing, and anti-poverty programs promised to eliminate poverty in our time. In the short run, these programs lifted millions, especially in poor black communities. But the long-term effects were more complicated. By tying social support to government checks rather than stable jobs and family structures, the Great Society unintentionally deepened dependency and fractured the institutions, family, church, and local enterprise, that had sustained black resilience through centuries of struggle. The legacy of independence and enterprise of Booker T. Washington that helped reform the literacy rate in the black community and laid the foundation for black business had shifted more to Webb Du Bois' legacy that favored intellectualism and social justice, anchored in Marxism. The mid-1960s exposed the tension between legislative victories and lived realities. Just days after Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, riots erupted in Watts, Los Angeles. 2 more summers of unrest followed in Newark, Detroit, and dozens of other cities. These uprisings revealed that civil rights laws alone could not solve the frustrations of unemployment, police brutality, and crumbling urban neighborhoods. For many white Americans, the images of burning cities eroded their sympathy for the movement, fueling a backlash that Richard Nixon would soon harness. For many black activists, it was proof that the movement had to go beyond access and integration, toward economic justice, black power, and cultural independence. Johnson's presidency was a study in contradictions. He pushed through the most progressive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, yet privately used racist language and political calculation to shape his policies. He declared war on poverty, but his welfare system planted the seeds of generational dependency. He envisioned harmony, yet the nation burned in riots under his watch. In 1965, a report on black poverty was written by the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It was called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action, but it's popularly known as the Moynihan Report. The report warned that the real crisis in black America was not simply segregation, but the breakdown of the family, fueled by joblessness, poverty, and fatherlessness. Its findings were explosive, pointing to uncomfortable truths about culture and structure that many activists dismissed as blaming the victim. Johnson, fearing backlash, shelved the report even as the Great Society programs expanded welfare dependency. The debate it sparked revealed a fault line. Would America confront the root cause of racial disparities or simply expand programs to manage its effects? Johnson's legacy is not only one of rights won, but also of divisions widened. By tying black America to the Democratic Party through both civil rights and welfare, he reshaped the political map for generations, but left behind a deeper wound. The question of whether empowerment came through government programs, or whether those very programs trapped communities in cycles they could not escape. 1968 began with promise but quickly descended into tragedy. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, silencing the prophet of nonviolence at the very moment he was expanding his call from civil rights to economic justice. Just 2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy, who many believed could unite the poor, minorities, and working-class whites into a new coalition, was gunned down in Los Angeles. With their deaths, America lost 2 voices of hope, and with them, the fifth-party system lost its moral center. The grief soon turned to rage. After King's assassination, more than 100 American cities exploded in riots. Newark, Detroit, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. went up in flames, exposing the gap between the laws passed in Washington and the despair in the streets. Civil rights victories were real, but poverty, discrimination, and police brutality still defined daily life for millions. The nation that had been stitched together by Roosevelt's New Deal coalition was now tearing at the seams, unable to reconcile its soaring promises with its broken realities. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Vietnam delivered its own reckoning. In January, the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion that America was winning the war. Televisions beamed images of carnage into living rooms, and faith in government collapsed. President Lyndon Johnson, once the master of Congress, announced he would not run for re-election. His great society lay overshadowed by a war that consumed lives, resources, and trust. The Democratic Party, dominant since 1932, fractured under the weight of generational revolt, racial unrest, and a war without end. Out of this turmoil, a new political order emerged. In November, Richard Nixon won the presidency, appealing to a silent majority, weary of riots and cultural upheaval. Segregationist George Wallace captured millions of votes in the Deep South, signaling the final collapse of the Democratic Solid South. The Democratic Party became the party of minorities, intellectuals, and liberals. The Republican Party became the party of the South, suburbs, and conservatives. The coalition that had carried the fifth-party system for more than 3 decades, Southern whites, Northern immigrants, labor unions, and black voters, was gone. In its place stood a new alignment, forged in anger, fear, and division. The year 1968 did not simply close out an election cycle. It marked the death of an era. The fifth-party system, sustained for more than 3 decades by the New Deal coalition, collapsed in the smoke of Vietnam, in the flames of America's cities, and in the grief of assassinations. Out of its ashes, the sixth-party system was born. Democrats embraced progressive politics, tying their fortunes to the civil rights movement, expanding federal welfare programs, and broadening their tent to include feminism, public education reform, and the new language of social justice. Republicans, meanwhile, pivoted toward cultural conservatism and law and order, capturing the resentment of a silent majority unsettled by riots, protests, and rapid change. The fracture was complete. Black America was locked firmly into the Democratic Party, while the South and suburbs drifted to the GOP. Could a nation divided by race, class, culture, and war find unity again? Or would division itself become the permanent foundation of American politics?